though, that Rosenstein is being forced out. So much more on this to come throughout the day, for sure. Well, here now to weigh in is attorney and constitutional expert Byron Henry. Byron, thank you very much for joining us. We're going to get to what the president had to say last night in just a moment. That's what we brought you in for. But your comment on this potentially breaking news involving Rod Rosenstein.
Well, certainly it would be a routine shakeup at the Department of Justice if not for the Russia probe that you mentioned in the lead-in. This is going to complicate and probably place spotlights, maybe even make it following, daily on television, the confirmation hearings for Bill Barr, the President Trump's nominee to be Attorney General, because he would de facto be in charge of the Russia probe after Rosenstein exits and he becomes Attorney General. So that will probably make the Russia probe the sole issue with respect to his confirmation. And I know he's meeting with lawmakers soon, so we'll have to wait and see how that plays out.
Interesting. But yet also at the same time reports that Rosenstein is not being forced out.
Yeah, of course, that would make it more controversial, though the president probably has the authority to do so politically. The Democrats have threatened all sorts of things if he did so. And to this point, despite their disagreements, President Trump has resisted what some may say the urge or the desire to have Rosenstein leave voluntarily or involuntarily. So it sounds like he's going to leave voluntarily, which, as like I said, this is a routine shakeup of the Justice Department, if not for the Russia probe ongoing.
Okay. All right, so not potentially as big of a deal as we know it will be made out to be. Let's get back, though, to what the big discussion was last night in terms of the president and his address there from the Oval Office. If lawmakers can't make some headway on this funding deal today, what is the scope of the president's authority to actually act himself? Well,
interestingly, there are dozens of statutes where Congress has actually delegated authority to the President of the United States in a vast array of situations to use emergency powers to expend funds and take other actions without further congressional approval. In fact, there are statutes on the books which deal specifically with border security in an emergency situation that would fit this bill. So it is certainly not beyond the pale that President Trump both has the authority given to him by Congress to address this issue without their approval.
And as you're talking about that, I wanted just to pull up this full screen that we have that actually reference some of that, some of the codes and some of the other things that the president could use to authorize the building of this wall, but only during an emergency.
That's correct, and he stopped short of declaring an emergency in his address. Whether or not the administration determines it to be an emergency, I believe the statute that would most be applicable in this case would be one in which the Attorney General sends a memo to the President stating that there's an emergency, and the President decides whether to accept the Attorney General's recommendation to declare an emergency, and at that point that would basically institute his emergency powers, and then he could spend funds and take other actions without further approval.
Well, hearing President or the Democrats say, they're not going to agree to this, is there any path that the President can take that doesn't end up as a fight in the courts and doesn't end up just like the travel ban?
No, in fact, it's very similar, Heather, to the travel ban. Just remember that when the president declares an emergency, it was said over and over again that the courts would look at President Trump's reasoning behind the travel ban, meaning, is it really a crisis? Is there really a reason to ban? And the Supreme Court, following, regardless of who's president, following decades of precedent and jurisprudence, said we don't second-guess the president on national security issues. If the president declares an emergency, I would be very surprised if courts, especially the Supreme Court, second-guessed his determination that the immigration issue on the southern border is an emergency. He hasn't declared that, but that's just...
Would they be able to begin work on the wall while that was happening, though?
Well, certainly you would try to get an injunction like they did with the travel ban. That was short-lived. The Supreme Court stayed that. But the bottom line is most of the arguments against the wall, whether it's immoral, whether it's ineffective, those are political arguments, not legal. And if the president has the legal authority to build it, courts have no business stepping in. Congress would have to pass a law and stop it. And if President Trump vetoed the law, they'd have to override that veto.
Okay. Byron Henry, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you summing it up for us.
My pleasure.
All right, and we'll be right back.